She could have pressed the gas and left the wreck to fade in her rearview mirror. But that night, Diane chose to stop. And that choice would bend the course of two lives forever. Rain came down in sheets over Route 17, each diagonal streak slashing through the dim, jaundiced glow of the widely spaced street lamps. The wipers of the old Honda clunked back and forth, leaving momentary clear patches before the glass blurred again with water and mist. The dashboard clock had drifted past midnight. The heater hummed weakly, and from the back seat came the slow, steady breathing of her two daughters, the only rhythm in the car that wasn't mechanical. Diane gripped the wheel. She knew these roads. Slick, dark, endless, with only her own vigilance standing between her and disaster. The night shift had run later than planned. Her back still ached, her fingers still smelled faintly of bleach. But beneath the rain, the rattle of the heater, and the fatigue in her bones, there was a thin, fragile peace. She was taking her girls home. Rounding a long curve along the hillside, something flashed at the edge of her vision. A glow too low to be a street sign. Her foot eased off the gas before her brain even formed the thought. It wasn't a road marker or a hazard light. It was the tail lamp of a vehicle tipped on its side, one wheel still spinning like a broken windmill. In a heartbeat, she saw it. A dark BMW overturned, windows shattered, thin smoke curling from the hood like the breath of something wounded. "Mom?" her older daughter murmured. Diane drew in a steadying breath. "Stay in your seats. Seatbelts on. Don't open the doors." The Honda shuddered to a stop on the shoulder. She flicked on the hazard lights, took one last glance in the mirror, and ran into the rain. The wind slapped cold against her face. Water soaked through her shoes in seconds. The BMW's black body glistened under the streetlight, distorted in the rain. The driver's side door was crushed in, the airbag a deflated white shroud. Inside, a man slumped half sideways in the seat, head tilted at a dangerous angle, blood running down his temple and vanishing into the rain. "Sir, can you hear me?" Diane leaned in, voice calm though her pulse hammered in her ears. The man's eyes flickered open, pupils sluggish. Don't move me," he rasped, voice hoarse and broken. "My neck." "I'm not going to touch your neck." She ran her hand gently along his collarbone, no obvious breaks, then checked his breathing, his pulse, and visible wounds. Basic first aid training from years ago surfaced like muscle memory. She pulled the wool scarf from around her own neck, pressed it against the cut on his forehead to slow the bleeding, then slid her light jacket under his shoulder to keep him steady. "I'm calling an ambulance." "Signal? Bad here," he murmured, wincing. Diane knew he was right. On this stretch of road, cell service came and went like a shy firefly. She glanced back toward the Honda, two small faces pressed to the window. She signaled them to stay put. Then she jogged up the incline to a higher patch of ground, phone held high above her head, hunting for a signal. 1 bar, 2 bars. She hit 911. "Location?" came the dispatcher's voice through the hiss of rain. "Route 17, about half a mile south of mile marker 45, she said quickly. "1 vehicle rollover, male driver, conscious, bleeding from the head, possible neck injury." "Stay there," the voice replied. "Help is on the way." Back at the car, the man's eyes tracked her return. "My name's Diane," she said, checking the scarf again, watching for changes in his face. "What's yours?" A pause, as though even this was work. "Richard," he said at last. Then, with sudden urgency, I need to tell someone. Meeting tomorrow morning." "There's nothing more important than your neck right now," she said firmly. "Do you feel numbness, tingling, nausea?" "A little dizzy, right hand's numb." "Okay. Don't try to move." She kept her words slow, clear, willing her own tremors into stillness. A gust of wind bent the roadside trees, hurling rain into her eyes. Her oldest daughter tapped on the window, mouthing a question. Diane raised her thumb, the only reassurance she could give. "Those kids, yours?" Richard asked, his lips pulling into a faint, pained smile. "Yes," Diane said, eyes still locked on him. "They're fine." I'm sorry to trouble you." His voice drifted, the fight in it softening. Strands of wet hair clung to his forehead, making him look years younger, vulnerable, human. Somewhere inside her, compassion rose, not frantic, not pitying, but steady. On nights like this, in the rain, the line between rescuer and rescued thinned until all that was left were two people holding each other in the same fragile moment. In the distance, the siren began, faint at first, then swelling like a heartbeat finding its rhythm. Relief loosened the knot in her shoulders. "They're here," she said, meeting his eyes for the first time without fear. They were the eyes of a man used to making decisions, used to being listened to, but tonight they were simply the eyes of someone grateful not to be alone. Red and blue light painted the rain as the ambulance pulled up. 3 EMTs moved with quick precision. "Who called 911? "I did," Diane said. "Male, early 40s, conscious, head laceration, possible neck injury, right-hand numbness." "You did well." A female EMT nodded, fitting a neck brace onto Richard and asking questions Diane had already covered. They slid the backboard under him, moving with practiced care. He clutched at the edge of her scarf as though it was the last solid thing from before the crash. "We're taking him to St. Mary's," one medic said. "You want to ride along?" Diane glanced at the Honda. Two small silhouettes watched from the safety of their world. She shook her head. "I need to get them home. Please tell the doctor. He's conscious, responsive, complained of dizziness and numbness in his right hand." Richard's gaze found hers again. "Diane." He stopped, the words too heavy for his breath. "Thank you." The words were slow, deliberate, placed down like something precious. Diane nodded, the faintest smile touching her lips. "Anyone would have stopped," she said quietly. "Just focus on breathing." The ambulance doors shut with a solid click. Lights painted streaks on the rain as they faded into the darkness. Diane stood for a long moment, letting the rain wash the chemical smell from her hair, the siren's echo pulling her heartbeat back to normal. She returned to the Honda, where warmth and the faint scent of her children wrapped around her like a blanket. "Is he gonna be okay, Mom?" "He will be. We just helped him get to the hospital." Her youngest sighed in relief. The older one stared at her longer than usual, as if storing this moment for a future word: courage. The Honda's engine coughed to life. In the mirror, Diane's eyes were shadowed, then cleared again. The light of someone who had learned to stand tall through long, hard days. The road unspooled ahead, slick and black. But something had shifted. The silence inside the car was no longer the silence of fatigue, but the silence of a choice made in the right moment. To stop, not pass by. And sometimes choices like that rewrote the map of a life. At mile marker 46, her phone buzzed softly. A text from an unknown number. "This is St. Mary's Rescue. The patient is in the ER. Vital signs stable. Thank you for calling when you did." Diane smiled to herself, fingers tightening on the wheel. "Stable," she repeated inwardly. Not just about him, but about herself. The apartment waited at the end of the road. Peeling paint, a coughing heater, a warped wooden table where the three of them ate, studied, taped up reminders. Tomorrow she would wake before dawn, pack lunches, walk the girls to school, then head back for her night shift on the 15th floor, where she would roll out the cleaning cloth, push the mop, and keep someone else's lights bright. That life wouldn't change because of one rainy night. But somewhere back on Route 17, at the curve where the BMW lay on its side, an invisible thread now linked her to a man named Richard. She didn't know who he was beyond a victim. She didn't know where his car usually slept or whether he'd remember her scarf in the morning. She only knew she had stopped, done the right thing, and that was enough to breathe easier in the rain. The lights of the apartment complex glowed like the windows of a ship at anchor. Diane turned into the lot, killed the engine, and let a quiet fullness settle in the silence. She leaned into the back seat, tucking the blanket around her girls, kissing the damp crown of a small head. "We're home," she whispered. Outside, the rain kept falling, patient, as if the night wanted to hold its secret for one more chapter. And on Route 17, the tire marks, the diluted trail of blood, the forgotten scarf would all fade with the night. All that would remain was the sharp, bright truth of the headlamps. Tonight, Diane had stopped. And tomorrow, though neither of them knew it yet, both her life and the man's would be traveling a very different road. He could have sent flowers and been done with it. But Richard Davidson wasn't a man who left debts, especially not the kind that changed the way you looked at the road at night. St. Mary's smelled of antiseptic and stale coffee, the kind that had been sitting on a burner since before dawn. Outside the ER's glass doors, dawn was nothing more than a pale smear on the horizon, rain still dripping from the roofline in slow, deliberate ticks. Richard lay in a curtained cubicle, the neck brace gone, stitches tight above his temple. The world had steadied but still swayed at the edges. His suit jacket had been cut away. His watch, wallet, and phone lay in a plastic hospital bag on the counter. The doctor had assured him, no fractures, just a concussion, some bruised ribs, and a head wound that would make him look, in the doctor's words, like he'd lost a bar fight. Richard had almost laughed, except laughter still tugged at the ache in his ribs. It would have been easy, expected even, to send a bouquet with a perfunctory note. A wire transfer if he really wanted to feel square about it. But as the night replayed in fragments, the cold rain, her steady hands, the sight of her children's faces in that fogged-up Honda, he knew those gestures would feel insulting. This wasn't a debt you cleared with money. "Excuse me," he asked the nurse. "The woman who found me, did she leave her number?" The nurse flipped through a clipboard, shook her head. "She said you'd be fine. Didn't want anything." That landed heavier than he expected. Not wanting anything, in his world, that was rare. People always wanted something, a contract signed, a call returned, an endorsement whispered in the right ear. "She had 2 kids with her," he said, more to himself than the nurse. "She stopped anyway." The nurse gave him a non-committal smile and moved on. By mid-morning, Richard was released. Outside, the rain had burned away into the kind of cool, clean air that follows a storm. His driver, seeing the bandage and the hospital wristband, tightened his jaw but said nothing. "Take me to headquarters," Richard said. The elevator to the 15th floor of Davidson Industries was lined in brushed steel, smelling faintly of ozone and perfume from someone who'd used it before him. The familiar lobby, glass walls, framed awards, the company crest gleaming above the reception desk, greeted him like an old suit that still fit perfectly. But before he reached his office, something in the far hallway caught his eye. A woman in navy work slacks and a gray polo embroidered with the company logo was hauling a mop bucket, her dark hair pulled back in a no-nonsense knot. The movement was efficient, unhurried, the way you moved when you'd done the same task 1,000 times. She turned her head at the sound of his shoes on the tile. "Diane?" She froze for a fraction of a second, not the startled flinch of someone caught doing wrong, but the careful pause of a person deciding how much of herself to show. "Mr. Davidson," she said finally, her voice even. "I was hoping to find you." "You found me?" she said with a faint smile, resuming the slow push of the mop. "I wanted to thank you. Properly." "There's no need. Anyone would have—" "No," he cut in gently. "Not anyone." The pause stretched between them. Somewhere down the hall, a printer whirred and stopped. "You didn't leave your number at the hospital," he said. "I didn't think you'd need it." He studied her face. Up close, there was a steadiness in her eyes that matched the memory from the roadside, the kind of steadiness you either inherited or earned the hard way. He also saw the faint shadows under her eyes, the signs of someone used to long hours and little sleep. "Would you take this?" He slid a business card from his wallet, holding it out between two fingers. "If you ever need anything at all, call me." Diane glanced at the card but didn't reach for it right away. "I don't take favors, Mr. Davidson." "It's not a favor," he said, his voice quiet but sure. "It's a door. You decide whether to open it." This time she took the card, slipped it into her pocket like it was nothing, though something in her expression shifted. Not trust, not yet, but the acknowledgement of a line drawn between them. He left her to her work. But the image of her standing in that hallway, mop in hand, chin lifted, followed him into his office. He knew her name now, her face, the sound of her voice. And he had the unsettling sense that their paths were only just beginning to cross. The 15th floor of Davidson Industries looked different at night. By day, it was a hive, glass-walled conference rooms buzzing with clipped voices, the scent of expensive coffee drifting through air-conditioned corridors, shoes clicking across polished marble. By night, the space turned into something quieter, almost sacred. The skyline pressed in through the glass like an audience, and the hum of the building dropped to a deep, steady breath. Richard had stayed late to review quarterly reports. The board meeting was 2 days away, and there were numbers that didn't sit right with him. Too neat in some places, oddly inflated in others. He was leaning over a chart when he heard the faint roll of wheels on tile. He knew that sound now. Down the hallway, Diane pushed her cart, spray bottles lined in a neat row, mop head still damp from the floor she had just finished. She wore the same navy slacks, the same gray polo, but without the sharp hallway lights of their last meeting, her presence felt different. Calmer. "Working late again," Richard said, his voice carrying in the stillness. She glanced up from her cart, not startled, but assessing. "You too, apparently." "Numbers don't sleep," he said, tapping the folder in his hand. "And floors don't clean themselves." A flicker of amusement crossed her face. "No, they don't." He found himself studying her the way he might study a candidate for a senior role, not just what she did, but how she carried herself doing it. There was no slouch in her posture, no wasted movement. Every task seemed to be part of some quiet system she had refined over time. "Diane," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "What did you do before this?" She hesitated, the mop handle resting lightly in her hands. "I have a business degree. Worked in operations at a small firm for a while." Her tone was neutral, as if she were reading the weather report. "And now?" "Now, I keep things running here in a different way." He caught the unspoken part, that the different way wasn't by choice. "Why the change?" he asked. Her eyes didn't waver. "My husband passed away. Medical bills, mortgage. The kind of math you can't make balance on a spreadsheet, no matter how good you are with numbers. This job pays steady. It's at night, so I'm there for my girls in the mornings." Richard straightened slightly. "That was not the answer he expected, though he supposed it should have been. In his world, career changes were strategic moves, pivot opportunities, or market shifts. In hers, they were survival. "You still keep up with the business world?" he asked. "I read the news," she said simply, "and I watch." "Watch?" She gave a small shrug, as if it were nothing. "People talk when they think no one important is around. You'd be surprised what you can learn just by wiping down a table." Richard smiled faintly at that. A smile that held more weight than the joke deserved. They spoke for a few minutes more, the conversation looping from work to the weather to the endless construction on Route 17. Then he excused himself, saying he had to finish the reports before midnight. But when he reached his office, the numbers in front of him blurred, replaced by the image of Diane pushing that cart, her eyes clear and unflinching. The next afternoon, as he sat in a planning session with 2 vice presidents and a consultant from Boston, an idea lodged itself in his mind. What would she see in this room, he wondered, if she were here? By the time the meeting ended, the idea had hardened into a plan. The invitation arrived in the smallest, most unremarkable way. A folded note slipped under the break room door. It was short, written in his brisk, slanted hand. "Diane, if you have a moment this afternoon, stop by my office. I have something I'd like to discuss. R.D." She read it twice, unsure if she should even keep it. Afternoon? She didn't work afternoons. By then, she would be home, helping her youngest sound out words from a library book while the older one spread homework across the kitchen table. Still, something in her told her to go. When she stepped off the elevator onto the 15th floor, the air felt different from her night shifts. Brighter, but also sharper, as if every beam of light was designed to keep people from hiding. She was aware of her shoes against the marble, the absence of her cart like a missing limb. Richard's assistant looked up from her computer. "You must be Diane," she said. "He's expecting you." The office was a study in restrained power. Walnut shelves, an antique clock ticking on the wall, the skyline spilling in behind a desk that seemed more like a command center. Richard was standing by the window, jacket off, sleeves rolled to his elbows. "Thanks for coming," he said, motioning to the chair opposite his. Diane sat carefully, hands folded in her lap. "I'm guessing this isn't about the floors." "No," he said, smiling faintly. "It's about the way you see things." She raised an eyebrow. "The way I see things?" "In the hallway the other night, you told me people talk when they think no one important is around." He leaned forward, elbows on the desk. "That tells me you notice details, patterns, connections. That's not a janitor's job description. That's an analyst's instinct." "I haven't worked in an office in years," she said, a thread of caution in her voice. "Doesn't matter. Skill doesn't vanish because it's unused. It just waits." She looked down at her hands. "What exactly are you offering?" "A trial position in our administration department," he said. "Data review, internal process checks. You'd be sitting in on some meetings, taking notes, and occasionally I might ask for your take on what you've heard." "That sounds like more than just note-taking." "It is, but I won't pretend it's a gift. I don't give those, I give opportunities. What you do with it is yours." Diane hesitated. "And if I fail?" "Then you'll know you tried. And so will I." The directness of it left no place to hide. She thought of her daughters, of the rent notice folded in the kitchen drawer, of the grocery list she'd trimmed down twice this week, of the mornings when she'd told herself that scraping by was still surviving. "Let me think about it," she said at last. "Of course," Richard replied, leaning back. "But for what it's worth, I'm not in the habit of betting on the wrong person." When she left his office, The city's hum hit her differently. It was the same sound: traffic, horns, the pulse of 100 conversations in the streets below, but it felt like the background to a decision that could redraw the map of her life. The boardroom at Davidson Industries was a long rectangle of glass and walnut, perched high enough above the city that the streets looked like narrow rivers of light. Diane had never been in it before. At night, she had cleaned around its edges, polished the table, emptied the bins, straightened chairs so they faced the same invisible horizon. She had never sat in one. Today, she was sitting at the far end, a legal pad and pen in front of her, a carafe of water within reach. Richard had said very little when she arrived. Just observe, take notes. Nothing more. But his eyes had held that look, the one she'd seen in people placing a quiet bet they thought they could win. One by one, the directors filed in. Men and women in tailored suits, their conversations a mix of numbers, names, and coded shorthand. A consultant with slicked-back hair set up a laptop and projected a spreadsheet onto the wall. The topic was a pending acquisition, a mid-sized logistics firm with operations in 3 states. On paper, the deal looked promising. The consultant spoke about market share, scalability, and synergistic alignment, clicking through slides as if reciting a language everyone in the room was born speaking. Diane scribbled quietly, tracking not just the figures, but the tone shifts, the slight tightening in a director's jaw when the projected revenue curve appeared, the way another tapped her pen during talk of short-term debt leverage. Then came the part where questions were opened. The finance VP, a man with the deliberate calm of someone who knew he carried weight, asked about projected margins in year 2. The consultant answered smoothly, too smoothly. It was then that Diane saw it. A line buried deep in one of the slides, a cost adjustment noted in fine print, tied to contractual renegotiations. To most eyes, it would read like a placeholder for negotiation flexibility. But she had worked in operations long enough to know that if those renegotiations failed, the cost base would eat into margins faster than anyone here was acknowledging. She kept writing. This wasn't her place. She was here to take notes. And yet, Richard's voice from 2 nights ago, I don't give favors. I give opportunities. She set down her pen. Excuse me, she said, her voice calm but carrying. The room stilled. Heads turned toward the far end of the table. I noticed the margin projections assume a cost reduction after the first year, she continued, gesturing to the slide. That depends on renegotiating supplier contracts. If those negotiations don't succeed, year 2 margins fall below baseline and the acquisition becomes a loss by Q3. Have those risks been modeled? Silence. The consultant's mouth opened, then closed again. The finance VP frowned, leaning forward. That's not in the summary, he said. It's in the footnote, Diane replied. Page 12. Chairs shifted. Pages flipped. The footnote stared back at them. Guilty in its tiny font. The conversation changed instantly. The questions sharpened. The tone lost its easy certainty. The finance VP pressed for alternate scenarios, and suddenly the acquisition that had looked like a sure thing was crawling with contingencies no one had wanted to touch. At the head of the table, Richard sat back, watching the shift with the faintest smile. When the meeting adjourned, the deal was put on hold pending further due diligence. As the directors filed out, Richard approached her. You weren't supposed to speak, he said. I know, Diane replied, but I'm glad you did. They walked out together. For the first time, she felt the quiet eyes of the 15th floor on her, not the glances that passed over a janitor, but the looks people gave when they realized they'd underestimated someone standing right in front of them. The days after the acquisition meeting moved differently. In the past, Diane could glide through the 15th floor like a shadow, mop in hand, head down, collecting the unguarded fragments of other people's conversations. Now, the same people who had once looked through her made a point of looking at her. The change was subtle at first. A nod from the finance VP in the hallway, a quick, good point in there from a junior director. But then Richard began calling her in on purpose. Sometimes it was for a numbers review. Sometimes it was to just sit in and listen. But it was never just that. He would ask, toward the end of a meeting, "Diane, what do you think?" In the same tone one might ask an auditor to verify a line item, not as decoration, but as necessity. At first, her answers were cautious, measured. She spoke when she had something that mattered enough to risk saying. But over weeks, those moments became more frequent. She could see gaps others skimmed over, inconsistencies buried under polished presentations. One Tuesday, during a heated budget discussion, she pointed out that a department was carrying duplicate vendor contracts, paying two different firms for overlapping services. The room went quiet. Then pens started moving, numbers recalculating. The projected savings from her observation were in the high six figures. Richard didn't hide his approval. "This is why she's here," he told the room, not bothering to lower his voice. The more she spoke, the more she realized she wasn't just answering his questions. She was setting a tone. People were starting to brace for the moment she might speak, the way they did when the company's legal counsel leaned in to whisper in a CEO's ear. But influence, she learned quickly, was a double-edged thing. In the elevator one evening, a mid-level manager gave her a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You've been busy," he said, almost idly. "Not everyone appreciates scrutiny." Diane held his gaze. "Then maybe not everyone should be in the room." The doors slid open. She stepped out first. Richard noticed the shift, too. One night, as they stood at the window of his office looking over the city lights, he said, "Some people are already wondering if you're here to help me, or watch them." "And what do you tell them?" she asked. "That I'm not sure yet," he said, half smiling. She knew he was joking, mostly. Still, the unease in some corners of the building was real. Influence attracts attention. Attention attracts enemies. And Diane, who had learned how to survive by blending in, was now learning what it meant to be impossible to ignore. She didn't know it yet, but the moment that would test her loyalty, and her nerve, was already taking shape in the shadows of the 15th floor. It started as nothing more than an after-hours favor. Richard had asked her to review a batch of expense reports from several regional branches, a task meant to free up the accounting team before an upcoming audit. Diane sat at a corner desk in the quiet operations wing, the only sounds the hum of the vending machine and the faint buzz of fluorescent lights. At first, the files were unremarkable: travel receipts, supply orders, maintenance fees. But halfway through the second folder, she noticed something that didn't match the patterns she'd come to know. Vendor names repeated in odd intervals. The same company invoicing for both equipment upgrades and consultation services, two categories that should have gone through entirely different approval channels. The amounts weren't huge individually, but over time they added up to something substantial. She dug deeper. It wasn't just one branch, it was three. And in each case, the approving signature belonged to the same cluster of mid-level directors. People Diane recognized from the hallway but had never spoken to. People who, she realized with a chill, had been unusually quiet in meetings where her questions made others shift in their chairs. The implications began to sharpen. If those contracts were padded or fictitious, someone was funneling company money into private pockets. And the web of signatures suggested it wasn't the work of one rogue employee. It was coordinated. A sound from the hallway made her look up. Footsteps. Not hurried, but deliberate. She closed the folder and angled it so the covers faced upward, casual. One of the names from the signatures list appeared in the doorway. a director in his 50s with an expensive watch and a smile that looked like it had been copied from a headshot. "Working late, I see," he said. "Just clearing some reports," she replied evenly. "Good to see that kind of dedication," he said, letting the pause hang. "Careful, though. Sometimes when you look too closely at things, you start seeing shadows that aren't there." He left before she could respond. Diane sat very still, her fingers pressed to the folder as if to hold it in place. Shadows that aren't there. The phrase echoed in her mind, twisting into something that felt like both a warning and a threat. That night, long after she'd gone home, she lay awake listening to the rain against her window. She thought of her daughters asleep in the next room, of the rent, of the fragile stability she had fought to build since her husband's death. Reporting this to Richard could blow everything open, or blow her off the 15th floor for good. If she was wrong, she'd be the one looking paranoid. If she was right, the people involved would have every reason to make her regret it. By morning, the decision was made. Fear had always told her to stay quiet, but trust, real trust, was a rarer voice. And she trusted Richard. When she stepped into his office that afternoon, she closed the door behind her. "I think we have a problem," she said, laying the folder on his desk. Richard flipped through the folder without speaking, his eyes scanning each page with the practiced efficiency of someone used to cutting through noise to find the signal. His office was quiet, except for the muted tick of the antique clock and the faint patter of rain against the glass. When he reached the third flagged report, his expression hardened. He set the page down slowly, as though laying a card on a table in a game where the stakes had just shifted. "You're certain about these patterns?" he asked. "Yes," Diane said. "It's not just sloppy bookkeeping. The vendor overlap, the duplicated approvals, they're deliberate, and it's not one person." "It's coordinated." Richard leaned back, folding his arms. "And you've kept this to yourself?" "For now," she replied. "Long enough to bring it to you first." He was silent for a moment, and in that pause Diane felt the weight of the decision passing between them. He could thank her and quietly bury this. He could turn it over to someone else and wash his hands of it. Or he could do the thing that would make enemies in his own ranks. "All right," he said finally, with a nod that was more like a vow. "We deal with it. Together." The word together landed heavier than she expected. He pulled a legal pad toward him and began sketching an outline, not of who to accuse, but of how to verify the data beyond dispute. "We'll need an internal audit," he said, "but not the standard one. If this group is careful, they'll see it coming a mile away." "You want it quiet?" Diane asked. "I want it invisible," Richard said, "until we have everything. And I want you to lead it." Her eyebrows lifted. "Me?" "You found it. You'll see things the auditors won't. I'll give you access to anything you need." It wasn't lost on her that accepting meant stepping fully into the line of fire. But something in the steadiness of his voice, and the fact that he hadn't once asked if she was right, told her that this was no longer about job titles. It was about trust. They spent the next hour mapping the approach. Diane would assemble a small team from departments with no ties to the directors in question, data analysts from satellite offices, a compliance officer who owed no favors to the 15th floor. They would review every vendor contract from the past 3 years, match approvals to bank records, and cross-reference service logs with on-the-ground confirmations. When they finished, Richard closed the folder, tapped it once, and looked at her. "If this goes wrong, they'll come after us both." Diane met his gaze. "Then we make sure it doesn't go wrong." For the first time since she'd stepped into Davidson Industries, she didn't feel like the invisible woman in the corner. She felt like someone standing at the table, someone with a voice, a stake, and an ally who wouldn't look away when things got dangerous. As she left his office, she passed the director with the expensive watch. He gave her that same too-perfect smile. but this time she didn't return it. She had work to do, and soon she would have proof. The boardroom was full when she walked in. 12 directors, 2 vice presidents. Richard at the head of the table, hands folded, face unreadable. The air was different today. Not the clipped professional tension of a high-stakes deal, but something heavier, charged. Diane felt it settle on her shoulders as she set a thick binder at her place and took her seat beside Richard. The first 20 minutes passed in standard reports. Sales projections, quarterly performance, market trends. Diane barely heard them. Her mind was locked on the folder in front of her, on the hours of work, the sleepless nights, the cross-checked numbers that had built it. When Richard finally cleared his throat, the room quieted. "Before we conclude," he said, "there's a matter we need to address. Diane?" Every head turned. Some faces neutral, others openly skeptical. A few already defensive. She stood, opening the binder. "Over the past 6 weeks, we've conducted a targeted review of vendor contracts and associated approvals. The findings show a consistent pattern of duplicate billings, inflated charges, and payments for services that were never rendered." She slid copies down the table, the paper whispering against the polished wood. "These discrepancies are concentrated in 3 branches, all approved by a recurring group of signatories, several of whom are sitting at this table." That last line landed like a dropped stone in water. Ripples of unease spread. One director, the man with the expensive watch, leaned back in his chair, voice silky. "These are serious accusations. Surely you're not implying deliberate misconduct?" "I'm not implying anything," Diane said, her tone steady. "The documents speak for themselves." Another director tried a different tactic. "Where did you even get this data? Compliance would never approve this kind of—" "I approved it," Richard cut in. His voice was calm, but there was steel underneath. "Diane had my full authorization, and I stand by her findings." The room fractured. Some murmured agreement. Others bristled, demanding external verification. 1 or 2 exchanged glances that said more than any denial could. Diane didn't flinch. She pointed to a page in the report. "On March 12th, a payment of $42,000 was made to a vendor listed as providing equipment upgrades. That same vendor billed $39,000 for consulting services 2 days later, approved by the same director, using the same invoice number with a different suffix. The pattern repeats 9 times across 3 branches." A silence followed that was sharper than any argument. Finally, the finance VP, the one who had once been skeptical of her presence in meetings, spoke. "This warrants a vote," he said. "Those implicated should be removed pending investigation." The vote wasn't unanimous. It never would be. But it was enough. One by one, the names tied to the fraud were suspended, escorted from the room by security before the meeting even adjourned. When the door shut behind the last of them, Richard turned to her. "You did well," he said simply. Diane let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. For the first time, she saw not just Richard's approval, but a shift in the rest of the room. The skeptical looks were gone. In their place was something rarer. Respect. She gathered her binder, the weight of it lighter now. The fight wasn't over, not in a company this size, not with enemies still in the shadows. But today, they had won. The 15th floor looked different now. Her name was on the frosted glass, Director of Ethics and Compliance. Inside, her desk was covered not with cleaning supplies, but with contracts, audit reports, and the occasional drawing from one of her daughters pinned to the corkboard. It had been 3 months since the boardroom showdown. The internal investigation had confirmed everything she and Richard uncovered. Policies were rewritten. Compliance systems tightened. Trust, fragile but growing, began to return to the hallways. For Diane, the change was more than a new title. It was the knowledge that she belonged here, that her seat at the table wasn't a borrowed chair but one she had earned, in the rain, in the quiet, in the moments when speaking up had been the riskier choice. That afternoon, her assistant buzzed in. "Mr. Davidson's here to see you." Richard stepped in without the air of a CEO visiting a subordinate. He carried no briefcase, no stack of documents, just the easy posture of someone arriving for a personal reason. "I wanted to see where you ended up," he said, glancing around the office with a faint smile. "You've seen the quarterly reports. I think we're doing all right," she replied. "That's not what I meant." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You saved me that night on Route 17, and you saved this company. I don't forget things like that." She shook her head. "I didn't do it alone." "No," he said, "but you did it when you didn't have to." For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the silence carrying all the nights and choices between them. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, a silver key with the Davidson Industries crest engraved on it. "This is symbolic," he said. "It's for the cabinet in the boardroom, the one with the company's founding documents. Only a few people have a key. I want you to be one of them." Diane took it, feeling its cool weight in her palm. "I'll take care of it," she said. "I know you will." Later that week, Richard made another visit, this time not to the 15th floor, but to the modest apartment where Diane lived with her girls. He arrived with no entourage, just a bag of groceries in one hand and a folded set of papers in the other. The girls, wide-eyed, ushered him in. He took a seat at the small kitchen table, the one with the nicked edges and the homework books stacked at one end. "I just came to say thank you," he told them, "for letting your mom be as fearless as she is. She's made this company better, and she's made me better." Her oldest daughter beamed. "We told her she was brave." Richard smiled at Diane. "They're right." When he left, the late afternoon sun was spilling across the street, catching the silver key still on the counter. Diane picked it up, twirling it between her fingers, and felt the quiet truth of it. That this was more than a job, more than a title. It was proof that she had taken the road no one expected her to take, and it had led somewhere worth standing. That night, as she closed her daughter's bedroom door and stood in the gentle hum of their small home, Diane thought back to the rain, the broken BMW, and the choice to stop. Some choices, she knew now, didn't just change the moment you were in. They changed the person you became. And Route 17, with its cold asphalt and flickering taillights, would always be the place where hers began. Thank you for staying with Diane's journey from that rain-swept night on Route 17 to her standing tall on the 15th floor. Your time, attention, and heart are what give stories like this their meaning. If her courage moved you, share this story with someone who might need the reminder that one choice, to stop, to speak, to stand, can change everything.